many people who leave long corporate careers like myself start afresh and apply all their knowledge in the art of putting capital where it should go in energy and sustainability.
What would you say is the biggest misconception about AI and the data centers?
Not enough distinction between AI as a workload and enterprise compute as a workload, all the way down to how people actually expect these two different things to perform on their laptops.
What Emerald AI does and how that background that you just mentioned, how that suits you for the role that you play.
Emerald AI is
Thank you so much for hitting play. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and this is Energy Central's Power Perspectives. What if data centers could be assets instead of concentrated load wildcards, giving everyone in this industry a big fat headache? What if we could use some mystical, magical technology to create a world in which not every conversation was centered around the phrase, what are we going to do about the data center thing? Turns out that magical technology may actually exist. It is artificial intelligence. At least that's the possibility we are exploring in today's episode. We're unpacking why integrating AI compute with power systems is technically hard, but full of opportunity, and what US utilities should do now to treat data centers as potential grid assets rather than uncontrollable loads. And we have a wonderful, wildly smart, and talented guest here to talk us through it. Arushi Sharma Frank is a technology platform investor and policy savvy expert in a wide range of topics, including power plants, batteries, utility regulation, energy markets. She's advising NVIDIA-backed software startup Emerald AI on making AI data centers grid responsive. She's the founder of Luminary Strategies, and she's the former markets policy lead for Tesla. Her work on tech and grids and working those two things better together has been featured all over the industry. I feel like we need a drum roll sound effect on our edit on the back end here. We're really, really excited to have you here today, Arushi. How are you?
I am well, and the drum roll should be a tabla. The two, yes. We'll be sending you sound clips. We have it all
Perfect,
worked out.
perfect. I'll have my
We are
people
more
call your people.
interested as a team here on the Luminary Strategy side at making your podcast fun and cool all the time as much as we are in getting this episode done. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Kinsey.
Of course, of course. As I mentioned, we're really excited for this conversation today. And I will say a quick note before I get into the questions specifically, the overlap of AI and data centers slash large load slash all of this. It's something we talk about a lot in the Energy Central daily newsletter. Quick plug, if you want to subscribe to get the top headlines and energy news for free every weekday, check out the show notes for a sign up link. Now we'll get to the good stuff, which I'm really, really amped to get into. Arushi, I want to start here. I feel like anyone who heard that intro probably can understand that you've got a lot going on right now at any given day, any given point in time. Can you tell me a little bit more what your job is like today? Talk to me some about your role, what you spend your time working on these days.
Yes. So I think many people who leave long corporate careers like myself to start afresh and apply all their knowledge in the art of putting capital where it should go in energy and sustainability. It looks a little bit like what I do, but it's not as complete, I think, in everyone's early vision. And it's come to me over the past year. So 30% of my time is straight up articulating really tough concepts to policymakers in spaces where they haven't heard this stuff before. So I sit at CSIS, which is a think tank in DC. It's top rated in a lot of policy areas, one of the best think tanks in the world and in the country. And creating their deep power expertise practice is essentially my job as a non-resident advisor. A couple articles are there now, but I'm doing that for a very specific reason, which is that there is not a lot of actual utility policy and technical grid integration policy work happening in Washington, D.C., my hometown. And we have to leave the state to find it. So bringing it here, bringing it to our members, to our federal regulators is super important. So that's one third. The other third is the piece that is on the other side of the startup advising work, which is actually supporting the development thesis for sustainable data center campus design. And sustainable means that the solutions we put into the ground now, that we design around, that we work with utilities with, they actually work at scale and they work for the utility, they work for the ratepayers, they work for the data center developer, and they work for the model that the data center is being developed under. So by being in those models, whether it's the powered land, powered shell, you're flipping a campus entirely because you just want a hyperscaler to buy it, I actually actively participate with my own time, labor, and capital in those projects so that I can see the landscape that I need to change. Then the third piece is, of course, what we're talking about primarily, which is advising startups that are providing technology solutions to make a lot of these grid to tech conversations real.
Yeah, and that last third, and I imagine all of these individual thirds probably feel like a full-time job. So I appreciate you taking the time today. That last third specifically on advising these tech startups, I want to dig into that a lot more today, as you mentioned. Let's start with what Emerald AI does and how that background that you just mentioned in policy, markets, strategy, how that suits you for the role that you play on the Emerald AI team. Talk to me a little bit about what they do and what you do to help them do that work.
Sure. So the long-term thesis of Emerald AI is bigger than what you might read in any one news article. Emerald AI is a bunch of software, data scientists, engineers of software solutions, and AI applications of software to create modularity in how compute load responds to different signals they may get from the site's main server or the utility above the site, and creating the entire conversational dialogue between what's happening at the GPU, rack, server level, all the way to the SCADA integrated site control for the site. And I just threw a bunch of words out there that for typical folks are not normal, but I think in our audience vocabulary today, this is very normal. And I would like utilities in particular to think about this as an evolution of how they always talk to their loads. With generators, because they're integrated to how we run and plan the transmission system, utilities have far more sophisticated, integrated ways, or even standardized ways of talking to generators. And there's lots of software packages and suites that allow folks to go over the air, if you will. With loads, one of my utility management friends just morning actually reminded me that the large conventional manufacturing loads are essentially they have air gaps, meaning there's a gap between where the utility's ability to pick up the electronic phone ends and where the control system of what's happening at the load actually begin. So filling that air gap and thinking about it as, oh, not only can we fill the air gap and close the loop where when the utility says there's a grid emergency coming or there's a alert coming that requires us to call in reserves and we want to call a new data center to shift your load by a percentage point so that I don't need to pick up the phone and call my industrial loads to start curtailing. That air gap closure all the way down to what's happening behind that is the full stack what Emerald needs to do. And the critical piece of it is that while that is happening, that architecture is layering on top of Emerald's core competency, which is ensuring that the service level agreements, i.e., the type of compute that is supposed to be being delivered by the compute architecture at the data center site, is actually happening. And it's happening in compliance with whatever the service level agreements are. So that includes Emerald's capacity with their orchestrator platform. It's the orchestrator is called Conductor. It is able to pause, slow, and shift workloads directly in proportion to the amount of allowance each type of workload has. I'm talking about tagging on an individual contract by contract, workload by workload basis. And the reason it's so interesting to me is that I've just finished a 4-year tour at a company that made this exact type of deep site and asset specific orchestration possible for Powerwall. Tesla's Powerwall product is the home residential battery. I've also worked, of course, on Megapack, which is a large utility battery integrated product as well. And bringing these technology stacks to market in complex grid and utility environments, it means fulfilling the conversation between an asset, all of the funny stuff around the asset. What does the customer want? When do they want it? How long do they want it for? And then monetizing what's left that there's actually wiggle room to work with and putting into a program that can be utilized by the utility or the broader grid to do two things, both deliver better power to those users themselves and then B, help prevent emergencies that cause a problem for everyone on the system.
I think that this might be one of the best, like, intro answers to any of the the questions that we've asked on the podcast in quite some
I
time.
should
You
have
know,
said
that
I'm a professor too. That's where
yeah,
that part comes from.
I can tell. I
That's why
think that
there's a
this
marker
really
board here, Kinsey. It's hiding, like,
yeah.
gobs of syllables and other junk I've just piled in because I desperately want to teach it next year, and it'll probably be 5 years before I look at it, so there's a board.
Sign me up. Take a picture of the whiteboard. Never let it get erased. Yeah. But I think that this is a great way to start this conversation because it tees up a lot of the really important things that I want to dig into today. A lot of that will focus on, solutions and being in that solutions oriented mind frame of what Emerald AI specifically is doing, what the learnings have been along the way. Before we get into that, I do want to make sure that we've just like really articulated the problem as much as we can and to make it really clear what the need is, what the demand is for a solution here when we're talking about, these large loads like data centers. And one thing that I want to get into is the idea of like flexibility specifically feels very different for these hyperscalers for large loads. Can you talk to me about what has been missing up to this point in terms of, the demand cycle day to day, week to week, quarter to quarter for a large load like a hyperscaler compared to what we might be used to? A lot of people talk about demand response programs that are more in the home, a VPP. This is different. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that's different and why that presents a problem that needs solving in the first place?
I have this desire to use my marker board and kind of
Hey,
show you. I'll
I'm
articulate it
down if you
first, and
are.
perhaps the photo, the drawing will come after the fact.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, maybe I'll do that first, so we can cut it in. Should we give
Yeah,
that a quick
we can
shot?
we can we can flash some graphics on the screen. This is a great plug
Okay.
to, watch these podcasts on YouTube.
Yes, 100%. So this is the marker board. Okay.
Okay.
So you just asked me about, let's start from here. So you asked me about flexibility at data centers and what are the
Yes.
gaps to make that real in with grids and with utility programs that have conventionally attempted to pay various customer classes for flexibility.
Mhm.
Okay. So right now, data centers split their power usage to essentially look like on average, people get mad because there's lots of numbers around here. But about half of it is the compute itself today, and the other half is not compute. And then as data center technology revolutionizes around the process of compute itself, a lot of the utilization of power is going to move to a point where almost nothing is happening on the campus except for compute. So all the power
Mhm.
usage moves to the compute part, right? That's the vision of like Jensen Huang's, AI knowledge factories in the dark, just doing whatever in real time and beaming power all over the world, which I think is fabulous, and I want that to be real, and come for all of us. But what you just described is flexibility is specific to what certain devices or clusters of devices do, which is very different than dispatchability. Dispatchability is what a utility is usually looking for or a grid operator is looking for. So just in boxes. This is your actual compute, your data center building
Okay.
and stuff inside the building. This is a different building. Call this B2. And this is everything else. Well, let's call this what it actually is, which is known as station power or aux load.
Okay.
Yeah. And then enter fun item number 4, which is a generator. So when people talk about flexibility, the narrative right now is this assumption, which is mistaken from our utility grid operator's perspective, that everybody's talking about messing with the compliance of B1 and B2 with its workload obligations. When in reality, a lot of these campuses can and should, and some of them are being designed so that what the utility needs, which is dispatchability of the site, can come from other things around the fundamental workload obligations. And not only
Mhm.
that, they can all come as a stack. You can run your backup generator first or your non backup generator first. You can add batteries, which support both the oscillation problems of the data centers as well as provide a little extra reserve to support power needs. You can isolate data center A and B. So if one supports very granular and sensitive load compute activities that never does anything, and all of the 99.999, like the tier 4 power reliability, is all over here. And this one's a tier 1 or a tier 2 site, right, as a building. And all of these can have shared or separate auxiliary loads, which are where here, this building here,
Mhm.
um, depending on whether they have and are wired for that 9919 reliability or not. And the utility's job, really, honestly, is to call the dispatch center for this data center, or send a SCADA signal, or come up with 5 or 6 other ways to do this, really. They're not standardized today. And say, we need 100 hours. You can deliver those 100 hours from all sorts of different solutions. And if you're doing it, by the way, in a market that has things that Emerald is working on, which includes not just slowing and pausing workloads based on their compliance requirements, but also shifting them to a different grid altogether. If you're also working with those options, or you're working in a market like ERCOT, where that site is part of a portfolio that participates with the grid at large as a portfolio, then when the grid operator needs dispatchability, your D isn't even responsive to this one campus. There's like 12 or 13 or 15 different ways that you can respond with dispatchability solutions, or call one of your buddies who has already procured ancillary service obligations and ask them to take your obligation on. So in power markets, which is kind of the next level of this, we already solve for the idea that flexibility comes from many places, even though we commit for it from one place. In the transmission planners world, which is a little bit different, flexibility can come from here. You can be asked from this site, and you can deliver it from this site. But if this site can shift workload to a site next door, and the site control or the conversational architecture between the two of them is consistent, then the utility can call the right site instead of the wrong one. And if you think about DERs conventionally and why it can be hard for some utilities to envision having a lot of distributed energy or grid edge assets on their system, it's because they don't have a mechanism yet to have nodal shift factors, i.e., at a specific node, tell one site that's very impactful or one group of sites to respond a certain way versus a different one based on meaningful congestion happening at those nodes. Right? And if you think about it, data centers are almost like if you took every data center campus like this and you combine them into sets of eight half a gigawatt sites, is a lot of VPP power. If you can create a nodal instruction scheme that would just send all of these sites to do the work that they could do to keep the system balanced. So that is the level of integration architecture thinking that is really required. And when I read a lot of the news about flexibility, I personally get kind of worried that our narrative is so narrow that we're not thinking as big as we should be. And I know this podcast in particular goes to all my utility friends, and some of them have wonderful evangelists who are working on these types of solutions right now, but others could be too. And I think it's important to have the utility side engage in this conversation and try to draw out the creativity from the development in the load community as well.
Yeah, this is a great class. I hope the midterm's easy. But no, this is really helpful to see it. I'm a visual person, and seeing it on the board is helpful for sure. A lot of this makes abundant sense. It makes a lot of sense that this would be the natural direction of innovation in a space like this and with a problem like this. Just for the sake of better understanding the problem, as I mentioned before, what has been the holdup up to this point? What are the significant challenges to deploying, what Emerald AI is doing, for instance, at scale? What are you thinking about right now to get in front of, to get ahead of? What are you blocking and tackling when it comes to, scaling this and scaling this as a solution?
So one of the issues is that it is very hard in the US to work directly with transmission planners.
Mm.
Emerald just announced a partnership with National Grid in the UK, where National Grid has the transmission operation responsibility for the United Kingdom. And that partnership is huge because it's an unlock of a level that is very difficult to do in the United States with any given transmission entity. So that's a block and tackle type issue, because while any one company can keep designing bespoke solutions, it really becomes a question of how fast can we build something that is standardized. Some percentage of what is standardized from the grid operator's perspective might need to be open source. I'll give you an example of that. Open ADR, right? That's an open compliance and comm standard. IEEE 2030.5. All my utility managers who are listening to this know exactly what I'm talking about. So these these communication standards that we've created that have applied primarily in the DER inverter-based resource category of things connecting to the big grid, we have to standardize. So for me, one of the long games is to think about the best ways to do that And the other piece where Emerald is so unique and significant, and Jensen Huang knows it because NVIDIA's tech venture side is invested in the company, that we need to have singularities. There needs to be verticalization in some space, which is why Emerald is building for the NVIDIA reference design, right? They're part of the Omniverse blueprint of software companies. And there are many, by the way. There's a long list of published companies we can drop in the show notes. But the reasoning behind all of this is that yeah, any tech company recognizes that there's a desperate need for standardization early. Even in my prior employment life at Tesla, when Tesla announced the open source availability for their supercharger standard, which was NACS, that was the thesis behind it. That yes, we aren't going to be the only folks who build to this standard, but if the standard doesn't exist, we have endless inefficiencies in the meeting of the minds between these complex tech solutions and the customer, which includes, of course, utilities themselves as either the providers of or the builders of that same infrastructure. So yeah, that to me is still very much the same problem I've always dealt with, and I'm always excited to invent around to solve, which is we have so many different utility systems. You have to invent the right thing. And you can't invent a version of the wrong thing for sure. So it's also my job to make sure I say help tech companies I advise say no to doing the wrong thing. And
Mhm.
then the right thing is going to be invented because we do need that. We need to create this framework of, I would say, commonly available solutions so that everybody can build the right specs on top of it. And ultimately, something like an NVIDIA reference standard becomes so commonplace that whoever is building a for profit thesis around an AI compute facility is, open and amenable to putting it into the things that they think are an investable thesis, right? And that's important because at some point, what's the other long game is we have to make sure capital actually comes to these solutions. If it doesn't come to these solutions because no one recognizes the difference between flexibility of load versus dispatchability of a campus in which load can play a part, that's already problematic. And of course, folks like me are out here to marker board it to help people understand it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it brings up an interesting, question I would love to hear your thoughts on. You have an audience of utility professionals listening to this right now. What's the message to them? What should they bring back to their teams to, say, hey, this is something that we should be talking about more. This is something we should be actively considering. We talked about the customer side of things and the storytelling that could there's room for improvement there. What do you say to utility leaders who are listening to this about,
Yeah.
what's the
Um,
sell?
I think primarily is don't wait for your regulator to tell you what to do. I've seen very few regulatory outcomes from, again, remember how our utilities are regulated? There are very few people. Charles Hua does a great job explaining this. He did a podcast with David Volts that should be in our show notes too. Um, with Dr. Volts, excuse me, David Roberts. And he says, we have these like 200 regulators that regulate the market value of just half of our electricity economy in the country that moves the rest of our economy in its entirety. And it's like regulators are awesome people. I have been asked to be one multiple times, and I just might someday when, the bug really hits me. It can't be our job to be as regulators of this industry, just constantly catching up and being reactive. So, how do you avoid reactive regulation? Well, you're proactive. So I tell utility executives in particular that I meet with that if you go to your commission with something exciting that meaningfully can solve a problem, and the second line says, we are co-creating a performance-based solution that rewards us based on savings to our customers and also saves our customers money, you will win. That's it. Each part of it is a problem in different areas of our regulated utility landscape, and it's also a problem in our deregulated areas. Performing means that someone should earn something for the performance. So if you're going to convince a utility to do something differently, just like you would convince me as a private investor to do it differently, I would like to make a buck on it instead of giving all of the money from my hard work to someone else. And unless you're of the mindset that the whole country can be deregulated in 5 years and our cost of service model just, like, vanishes into thin air, which is nonsense. Um, you need to be in a place where you can have a tough negotiation with yourself as a person, as a utility executive, and say, in 5 years, does my current business model even make sense? If the answer is no, which it should be if you're being honest with yourself, you need to be the person that goes out there and marshals your colleagues, your CFO in particular, your core investment um, group, for especially for the larger utilities, your co-op board, right? So utilities are owned by different different types of owners too, which makes this interesting. And say we're going to do it differently. That's it. That's where it has to start. And I think that another piece of this, if other utility professionals were to hear this that are not the executives, a lot of those folks have these ideas, but frankly, they're also doing the work of 5 people already. And that's another core problem that I see a lot, that there's just not enough time in the day to go through the activities of the day and then also come up with the most revolutionary proposals for how to create these co-created outcomes with ratepayers.
Yeah, and that's why we need more smart people working in the power
Yeah.
industry, like
Yeah, I that's one of the things I do around the teaching is fun, but I also do it because people are excited to see someone who has worked in big tech and also worked at utilities tell them that they should do it.
yeah.
There's very little of that. There are a lot of famed academics in this space, but there aren't folks who have built VPP programs and commissioned batteries and run compliance programs for nuclear power plants. All show up and are like, "Do this. This is really great." So yeah, it's an interesting time for me to just convince more students to get into this space. Like I just yesterday told someone who really wants to learn PJM to just go work at PJM. I said, just go work at it. Like, here's this
Yeah.
posting. Just go do it. And he's like, "Oh, really? I can do that?" "Yes, you can."
Yeah, you can and you should, like but I in all seriousness, I we will certainly, I'm sure, cut some clips from that answer, about what utilities should really be thinking about because it is direct from the source. This is the real stuff, and I imagine a lot of the conversations that you're having with people who are working at utilities, who, admittedly, to your point, are working like 7 jobs in the span of a day, right? A lot of the conversations that they want to be having are about this. They're about what can we do, how can we innovate, how can we close this innovation gap that exists between the customers who are building these data centers, the big tech, and the reality of the business model at utilities that has existed forever. I imagine also that part of convincing these utility professionals of the work that you're doing and of the possibility of this innovation of turning data centers into assets instead of liabilities, strictly speaking, is aided by real world examples. So I would love to hear a little bit more about specifically at Emerald AI, what recent pilots have shown, reductions, constraints, performance, etc. What are you watching? What has been promising? What is coming next?
Sure. So this is where a fun NVIDIA reference gets to come back in. So there is an NVIDIA blog, and it has a article on it called "AI Factories Can Reduce Grid Stress." It's something like that. We'll put it in the show notes. And what it has is a complete rundown, like a blog post rundown written by Mark Spieler, who is NVIDIA's global energy division head, about the demo outcome and results from Arizona, which is where Emerald did its first successful demos at a live data center campus location with Oracle as a partner. And there are other partners in that project as well. So we'll drop that in the show notes. But the fundamentals, I'm going to go backwards and tell you the mechanics of how this works. The Emerald software suite does both the simulation of what should happen, i.e., what should happen during power curtailment moments, minutes, hours, tranches of time, and the different compute workloads to make sure that we schedule and tag the power reduction or power slowing to the right jobs who can tolerate that slowing for that time period and still complete on time later, right? Or still keep complete on time with a slower compute cycle. So all of those things can be simulated. And then the data center on a small cluster of GPUs can actually show what has been simulated happening in real time during an actual heat wave event. So in the Oracle demos, which took place with 2 utilities, APS and SRP in Arizona, Emerald successfully essentially painted over the response that was required to be able to curtail the site during the utility's heat wave event, which was a very hot day, sweltering, and at the same time, also paint over the required compliance to ensure all the jobs were timely completed during that time on that cluster. So live Oracle campus related jobs. And on the NVIDIA blog, there is this double bathtub curve that is a model for what the simulator could do. So I made that. And the curve is essentially a representation of all of the little moments that happen before a major heat wave, taken from a California heat wave crisis that happened a few years ago and modeled as a way that the simulator suite could perform and show that you can not only curtail during the big event, you can provide reserves by curtailing a little bit beforehand, before the big event. So that to me, it's actually called the Arushi tub. It's
I love it.
I had this chart. So, I've been in the energy industry long enough that a lot of the bigger cold and hot weather grid crises are things that I remember, like from a data perspective. So I made this chart and I actually asked the Emerald team, like, these are all the big, snowstorms and heat waves. And they're all like the big, stuff hit the fans moments in our recent NERC history. Which one do you think is most interesting and might apply in Arizona? Like, let's work on that. And we have a chart. Like, I have made a chart that essentially has all of these different scenarios. And I think the most interesting part about that double bathtub or the Rushi tub that we're not calling it, which is like super flattering and great, like it's like a nerdy thing I like, um, is that it's demonstrative of like where the future is going to be anyway that we will invent, which is Kaiso should be able to call on reserves. When Kaiso calls on reserves, which is an ancillary service product. Again, for our audience, there are different kinds of utilities, but for the other folks who are listening, there's primary, secondary, and tertiary reserves. All of those are basically different kinds of ancillary services, and they go from super fast to super slow. So they're all different ways for the grid to rebalance itself over a slow period, a medium fast period, or a super fast period to respond to different problems. So back to the Kaiso ancillary services thesis, which is Kaiso should be able to pick up the phone in a decade if there are 5 1 gigawatt data centers connected in Kaiso and say, we have a potential heat wave, also a power safety shutoff coming on the Northern California grid. We pick up the phone and we call 3 of those 10 data centers that are registered as controllable assets for a fraction of their capacity. You guys come off our system from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Then you come off again a little bit more from 3 to 4, and there is no grid emergency. That's what it comes down to. And I think, Kinsey, another piece of this, just like the diagram behind my head, which resolves this question around flexibility of load versus dispatchability of load. This is the other side of it, that the whole point of building for all of this is that data centers as a grid helper help the grid in the reserve scenario, in the reserve deployment scenario. And they can help a utility operator who has transmission system safety concerns in particular, overloading of lines with thermal or voltage problems because there's so many users and something happens to a generator on the other side of the system. It helps them solve the problem with early information and early action. And that early action prevents the scenario that everybody talks about in the news, which is, oh no, curtailment of data centers, they're all going to shut off. What will happen to billions of dollars of revenue? Like, well, no, the whole point of this is to avoid that from happening.
Yeah, and it makes so much sense too. I appreciate you putting it in such plain terms because it's helpful to put a pin in all this, right? To kind of wrap the ribbon around it at the end of the conversation. Before I let you go, I do have one other question, and I'm glad that you bring up, Kaiso as an example. We recently did an episode about the VPP pilot in California over the summer, one of the most successful VPP pilots of that size in the country. What something like VPPs at scale could mean for the grid outside of California as well. I'm curious to hear, as we look to the future, as we think about what that future might look like, recognizing sort of where we've come from in terms of the admittedly probably smaller scale distributed energy resources, right? What have we learned from the proliferation of, VPP pilots like the one we were just mentioning, DERs or Powerwalls or whatever we want to use as the example here, from the scalability and the efforts to expand those kinds of technologies within and the specific grids and the country at large. Are there learnings from that experience that we
Yeah.
can apply to what you're working on today? And if there are, what are they?
For sure. I'm just laughing because there's so many learnings. I don't have enough time left on the pod to tell you all of them.
Maybe just a favorite. Maybe
Um,
just a favorite.
well, one of my favorites is how I actually met Emerald CEOs. So Varun Sivaram and just so you know, Varun's I say collaborator in chief is this brilliant data scientist, their chief data scientist, Aisha Koshkun, who has been at Boston University working on this problem of actually flexing loads as a demand response solution for well over a decade. So, very well published and really incredible person, who is backing Emerald as well. Just don't want to forget about the enormous number of top of class data scientists that this team has. But I was at a meeting where most of the folks in the room were, I would say, heads of various sustainability and investing portfolio companies that work in the grid design, sustainability space. And Varun just dropped the word in a comment, LFC. And, I think 80% of the folks just looked like, okay, I don't know what that is, but cool. And I responded, I said, which load frequency control signal are you talking about? Are you talking about 4-second reg in ISO New England or the PJM program? And which reg product are you talking about? Or are you talking about LFC through AGC? Like which program? And we just ended up having this hilarious grid acronym conversation. So if there's one lesson that I think is really important from VPP world to hear is that building this kind of tech stack comes with a dictionary of acronyms that frankly, we have to demystify. But then we need to go find the people who do already know them to make these programs real. Because in VPP world, just like we said, that itself is an acronym. Like, what the heck does virtual power plant mean to an average person? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't
Everything and
matter if you
nothing,
try to
right?
change it to distributed power plant. That's also like just nonsensical to, your family member at the dinner table. So languaging is one of my most important and favorite lessons of this whole industry is that whether it's grid edge or whether it's data centers at the edge, we have to figure out the language that works and invites more people in and connects more of us to get more of this work done.
I think Arushi, ending on this idea of ensuring that we have the right story to tell and that we are telling it in the right way feels very fitting. A lot of the conversation, heading into this today that I was so curious about was trying to demystify some of this to somebody like me who has not spent her entire career in utilities, in AI, in electric power, in any of these things that we talked about today. I have gotten an enormous amount of clarity out of this conversation. So I appreciate you giving me the rundown on the future class that I know you absolutely will
I
teach.
have a Hopkins professor review site on which nobody has left me a review, and so I'm gonna make you a fake student,
Okay.
and
I
that's how you
I'm a
pay me
real
back
student.
for your
You
enhanced learning.
you taught me something, I learned. I think I'm a student of life. So super quickly, we'll head into our lightning round to finish the conversation today. Just super quick answers. We'll keep it really short and spicy. The first one here: what would you say is the biggest misconception about AI and the data centers?
Not enough distinction between AI as a workload and enterprise compute as a workload, all the way down to how people actually expect these two different things to perform on their laptops.
Okay. What's one policy change that you would really like to champion to help unlock some of the opportunities we've talked about today, if you had to boil it down to one?
Singular implementable design for performance-based rates for utilities to do more cool stuff.
Do more cool stuff. Okay, perfect. And then the last one I have for you today, is there a thinker, a leader, an innovator, an entrepreneur, anybody in the industry you recommend people pay more attention to?
Yes, Rich Miller. He's a lot of fun. He writes on Substack. He has a data center newsletter. He covers all sorts of things at lightning speed, it seems. Not enough people use Substack in general. I write on Substack. A lot of my work gets read by utility professionals on Substack and by commission and their staff as well. and Rich is very prolific. So definitely. And I think that's important because we tend to kind of idolize folks who are raising capital, but the folks who are spreading knowledge are a different class entirely. And I think it's important to start paying attention to those folks and incorporating into your daily news stream.
Yeah. Amen. Okay. I love it. That was so wonderful. Once again, thank you so much, Arushi, for joining us today on Power Perspectives. Like I mentioned, I learned a ton. I'll go on Rate My Professor, whatever you need. I'm your girl. We'll get this all set up. And to everybody listening, make sure you check out the show notes. I know we will have a rich collection of things to read and check out and take a look at. And again, reminder that we are on YouTube if you want to see the visual of what Arushi has put on the whiteboard behind her today. I highly encourage it. It is very helpful for any of the visual learners out there like myself. So thank you so much, Arushi, for joining me today.
You're most welcome. Delighted to be here. And before I go, you have to know that I wrote an Energy Central post 4 years ago about the different kinds of load serving entities around the US, and it was very, very widely read. So thank you all
All
for what you
right.
do.
And thank you. The community would not exist without people like you.